The philosopher Seneca rented an apartment above a Roman bathhouse and nearly lost his mind. Through the floor, he could hear men grunting as they heaved lead weights, the sharp slap of hands striking oiled skin during massage, the screams of bathers having their armpit hair ripped out by tweezers, the ceaseless shouting of sausage sellers and pastry vendors, and the high-pitched shriek of a man who simply enjoyed hearing his own voice echo off the vaulted ceiling. And that was just the noise. The water in the great pools was changed infrequently, sometimes not for days, while hundreds of bodies cycled through it, sweating, bleeding, spitting. Senators, soldiers, freedmen, slaves, con artists, and pickpockets all crammed into the same echoing halls. This was nothing like the serene marble spa you might picture. Toga-clad philosophers murmuring beside turquoise pools. A Roman bathhouse was not a retreat from the world. It was the world, compressed, amplified, and stripped naked. So what was it really like to walk through those doors? To understand the Roman bathhouse, you first need to understand the world that built it. By the 2nd century AD, the Roman Empire had reached its greatest territorial extent, stretching from the rainy frontiers of Britannia to the scorching deserts of Mesopotamia, from the forests of Germania to the wheat fields of North Africa. Rome itself was a city of roughly 1 million people, by far the largest in the Western world, and it would not be matched in size for more than 1,000 years. The emperor at the height of the bathing culture was often Trajan, or his successor Hadrian, men who understood that controlling an empire was not only about legions and laws, but about giving the urban masses something to do with their afternoons. And the baths were the answer. The Roman state did not build bathhouses merely for hygiene, though hygiene was part of it. They built them as instruments of social control, civic identity, and political prestige. A massive new bathhouse complex announced to the people that their emperor cared about their comfort, their health, their leisure. It was propaganda in marble and concrete, and it was not limited to Rome. Every city in the empire, from the garrison towns of northern Britain to the oasis settlements of the Sahara, had its public baths. The legions carried the tradition to every frontier. Soldiers stationed at Hadrian's wall, cold, wet, miserable Northumbria, bathed in heated bathhouses built to the same plan as those in sunlit Italy. Excavations at the fort of Vindolanda have uncovered bathhouse remains with hypocaust pillars still standing, evidence that Roman soldiers considered hot bathing not a luxury but a necessity of civilized life, even at the edge of the known world. In North Africa, the baths of Antoninus at Carthage rivaled anything in Rome. In modern-day Turkey, the baths at Ephesus served a cosmopolitan population of Greeks, Jews, Egyptians. The uniformity was remarkable. You could walk into a bathhouse in any city of the empire and know exactly where you were going, because the layout was essentially the same everywhere. It was the McDonald's of the ancient world, a standardized experience replicated across 3 continents. The city of Rome alone had more than 800 bathing establishments by the 4th century, ranging from tiny neighborhood balneae, cramped and dark, where you paid a quadrans, the smallest coin in circulation, to the colossal imperial thermae that could hold thousands of bathers simultaneously. These great thermae, the baths of Trajan, the baths of Caracalla, the baths of Diocletian, were not just buildings. They were entire districts, walled compounds covering more ground than some medieval towns, containing not only bathing halls but gymnasiums, gardens, libraries, lecture halls, art galleries, and running tracks. If you were a Roman citizen of modest means, the thermae were your living room, your gym, your social club, and your entertainment center, all in one. You did not go to the baths simply to get clean. You went because it was where life happened. The tradition itself was ancient even by Roman standards. The earliest Roman baths were simple affairs, small rooms in private homes heated by portable braziers, where water was carried in by slaves and poured over the bather from clay vessels. Greek influence, arriving through conquest and cultural absorptions in the 2nd and 3rd centuries BC, transformed this private habit into a public institution. The Greeks had long practiced communal bathing attached to their gymnasia, and the Romans adopted the concept with characteristic ambition, scaling it up to dimensions the Greeks never imagined. By the time of Augustus, the first emperor, public bathing was already a deeply embedded habit. The statesman and General Agrippa, Augustus's closest friend and son-in-law, built the first great imperial thermae in 25 BC and, in a gesture that stunned the city, made admission free. He funded the operation from his personal fortune and bequeathed the baths to the Roman people upon his death. It set a precedent that subsequent emperors felt compelled to follow. Each new reign brought a new bathhouse, larger and more ornate than the last, because to build a great thermae was to write your name in the daily life of the people. Nero built one. Titus built one. Trajan built one atop the ruins of Nero's Golden House, deliberately replacing imperial excess with public generosity. Caracalla and Diocletian built the largest of all. The message was always the same. I give you this. Remember who built it. And the people did remember, not because the inscription above the door told them to, but because they walked through those doors every single day of their lives. Imagine approaching the Baths of Caracalla on a warm afternoon in the year 216 AD, the year they were completed. You would see them from a distance, an impossibility of architecture rising above the rooftops of the Aventine district, brick and concrete walls soaring to heights that rivaled a modern 6-story building. The complex covered roughly 27 acres, an area larger than many modern football stadiums, and the main bathing block alone stretched over 600 feet in length. As you drew closer, you would pass through landscaped gardens dotted with statues, copies of Greek masterworks, muscular athletes frozen in bronze, gods and goddesses in white marble. The air here already smelled different from the cramped streets you had left behind. The stench of the city, rotting garbage, open sewers, the acrid tang of fulleries where cloth was cleaned in human urine, gave way to something warmer, damper, faintly metallic. That smell was the bathhouse breathing, steam mixed with wood smoke from the furnaces below, olive oil rubbed into thousands of bodies, and the sharp mineral scent of heated water. You entered through a grand portico, columns of grey granite imported from Egypt flanking a doorway wide enough for a crowd. Inside, the scale hit you. The central hall, known as the Frigidarium, rose to a vaulted ceiling more than 100 feet high, higher than the nave of many Gothic cathedrals that would not be built for another 1,000 years. 3 enormous cross vaults span the space, supported by massive granite columns. The floor beneath your feet was a mosaic of black and white geometric patterns, and the walls were sheathed in coloured marble, green serpentine from Greece, purple porphyry from Egypt, yellow giallo antico from Tunisia. Light poured through vast arched windows set high in the walls, filling the space with a diffused golden glow. But look more carefully, and the grandeur revealed its wear. The mosaics had cracks where feet had worn grooves into the stone. The marble was stained in places where water had pooled, and mineral deposits had built up over months. The grout between the tiles was dark with grime. This was a public building used by an estimated 6,000 to 8,000 people every single day, and it showed. From the frigidarium, you could see the progression of rooms stretching before you like a sequence of increasingly warm chambers. To the south lay the tepidarium, the warm room, its air noticeably heavier, its walls radiating gentle heat. Beyond that, the caldarium, the hot room, where the temperature could reach levels comparable to a modern sauna. Some scholars estimate between 100 and 120 degrees Fahrenheit, though precise measurements are impossible. The caldarium was typically a circular room with a domed ceiling, its floor so hot from the hypocaust system below that bathers wore wooden sandals to avoid burning their feet. A great bronze basin called a labrum stood in the center, filled with cold water for bathers to splash on their faces when the heat became overwhelming. And beneath all of this, invisible to the bathers above, lay the true engine of the thermae, the hypocaust. A network of underground furnaces called prefurnia burned wood continuously, tons of it every day, sending hot air through channels beneath raised floors supported on stacks of brick pillars called pilae. The hot air rose through hollow spaces in the walls, called tubuli, before venting through openings in the roof. It was an engineering achievement of staggering sophistication for the ancient world, and it required an army of slaves to operate. These slaves, known as fornacatores, worked in shifts in near-total darkness, shoveling wood into roaring fires in temperatures that would be considered dangerous by any modern labor standard. But if you had descended the narrow stone stairway that led to the service corridors beneath the caldarium, you would have entered a different world entirely. The passages were low-ceilinged, cramped, thick with heat and the choking smell of burning wood. Soot coated every surface. The fornacatores moved in a hunched shuffle, feeding logs into the mouths of the prefurnia, raking out ash, adjusting iron dampers to control airflow. The temperature in these tunnels could exceed 150 degrees Fahrenheit near the fireboxes. Burns were routine. Respiratory illness from constant smoke inhalation was inevitable. The average lifespan of a fornicator was not something anyone bothered to record, because no one who mattered was counting. Beyond the hypocaust, the water supply system was equally hidden and equally extraordinary. The Baths of Caracalla were fed by a dedicated branch of the Aqua Marcia aqueduct, one of Rome's 11 major water conduits, which carried fresh water from springs in the hills more than 50 miles away. Enormous lead-lined cisterns sat above the bathing halls, gravity feeding water into the pools and the labrum basins below. The volume of water consumed was staggering. Modern estimates suggest the Baths of Caracalla used roughly 2,000 gallons per bather per day, a figure that would horrify any modern water utility. But Rome had water to spare. At its peak, the aqueduct system delivered an estimated 200 million gallons of fresh water to the city every day, more per capita than many modern cities manage. Your afternoon at the baths followed a rhythm as familiar to a Roman as a morning commute is to you. The baths typically opened at midday or in the early afternoon, the 8th hour by Roman reckoning, roughly 1 or 2 o'clock by our count, and the signal was unmistakable. A large bronze bell or gong was struck, and its deep tone carried across the neighborhood. The poet Martial joked that no alarm clock was as reliable as the bathhouse bell. Within minutes, the streets around the thermae would fill with people. You arrived already knowing the routine because you had done this hundreds of times before, possibly thousands. If you were a man of ordinary means, you paid your quadrans, roughly the price of a small loaf of bread, at the entrance. Women, when admitted, sometimes paid more, perhaps double. though practices varied by city and era. Children under a certain age entered free. Soldiers and sometimes other groups were exempt from payment during certain reigns. The first stop was the apoditerium, the changing room. This was a long hall lined with niches carved into the walls, each one just large enough to hold a folded toga, a pair of sandals, and a small cloth bundle of personal items. There were no locks. There were no doors on the niches. You simply placed your clothes in an open alcove and hoped for the best. Wealthier bathers brought a personal slave, a capsarius, whose sole job was to stand guard over the master's clothing. If you could not afford a capsarius, you kept one eye on your niche and one eye on everyone around you, because theft in the apoditerium was legendary. The Roman legal code devoted specific provisions to bathhouse theft. The jurist Ulpian wrote extensively on the question of liability. Who was responsible if your clothes were stolen while you bathed? The answer, in most cases, was nobody. You stood naked in the changing room among dozens or sometimes hundreds of other naked people. Romans had a fundamentally different relationship with nudity than most modern Western cultures. Public nakedness in the context of bathing and exercise was normal, expected, unremarkable. What was remarkable was your body itself. Your scars told your history, your musculature advertised your labor or your leisure, and your lack of body hair, if you chose to remove it, signaled your social aspirations. After undressing, many bathers began with exercise in the palaestra, the open-air courtyard attached to the baths. Here, you could wrestle, box, throw a heavy ball called a harpastum back and forth, lift stone or lead weights, or simply jog around the perimeter. Exercise was not a separate activity from bathing. It was the first stage. You worked up a sweat deliberately because the bathing sequence that followed was designed to exploit that open-pored, heated state. Once you had exercised enough, you entered the bathing circuit. The standard progression moved from warm to hot to cold. Tepidarium, then caldarium, then frigidarium. In the tepidarium, you acclimatized. The air was warm but not oppressive, and your muscles began to relax after the exertion of the palaestra. Attendants, slaves, almost always, circulated with flasks of olive oil. You applied this oil liberally to your entire body, or had someone apply it for you. This was not a luxury. It was the primary cleaning mechanism. Romans did not use soap in any form recognizable to us. Instead, they coated themselves in olive oil, allowed it to mix with the sweat and dirt on their skin, and then scraped the entire mixture off using a curved metal tool called a strigil. The strigil was a crescent-shaped blade, usually bronze or iron, and using it properly was something of an art. You could scrape yourself, but it was far better to have a slave or a friend do it, because the areas of your back that you could not reach were precisely the scrapings, a grey, oily paste of dead skin, sweat, dirt, and olive oil, were not discarded. They were collected. The scrapings from famous athletes were sold as a folk remedy, believed to cure everything from joint pain to inflammation. Even the scrapings of ordinary bathers had commercial value. They were sometimes used as an ingredient in poultices and ointments. From the tepidarium, you moved to the caldarium, and here the experience intensified. The heat hit you like a wall. Steam filled the air so thickly that you could barely see the person standing 3 feet away. The floor was scorching. Your wooden sandals clacked against the heated tiles as you shuffled toward the hot plunge pool, a large basin of water heated to temperatures that made your skin flush red within seconds. You lowered yourself in, feeling the heat penetrate deep into your muscles, loosening everything, making your heartbeat rise. Around you, other bathers sat or stood in the pool, their faces flushed, their voices echoing off the domed ceiling in a roar of conversation. Some men conducted business deals in the caldarium. Others argued politics. Others simply sat in silence, eyes closed, enduring the heat like a test of will. After you had soaked long enough, 5 minutes, 10, perhaps 20 if you could bear it, you climbed out and made your way to the frigidarium, the cold room. And here was the shock. The frigidarium was not merely cool. The plunge pool was fed by aqueduct water that had not been heated at all, and in winter it could be genuinely cold. You plunged in, and every muscle in your body seized. Your breath caught. Your skin contracted. And then, after a few seconds, a rush of exhilaration flooded through you. The ancient Roman equivalent of an ice bath, a jolt of vitality that made everything feel sharper, cleaner, more alive. Many bathers repeated this cycle, warm, hot, cold. The entire sequence could take anywhere from 1 to 3 hours, depending on how social you were and how much time you had. And time, for most Romans, was something they had in abundance. There was no concept of a 40-hour work week. Free Roman citizens, particularly in the capital, often had their afternoons entirely open, their basic needs for grain subsidized by the state. The baths were not just a hygienic ritual. They were how you spent your day. But not every Roman experienced the baths in this orderly, progressive sequence. If you were wealthy enough and eccentric enough, you might bathe 7 times a day, as Pliny the Elder reported some Romans did, cycling through the rooms obsessively, each round accompanied by fresh oil and a new scraping. The Emperor Commodus was said to bathe 7 or 8 times daily. At the other extreme, a laborer finishing a long shift at the docks or the construction sites might arrive at the baths with barely an hour before closing, rushing through the rooms with none of the languid socializing that wealthier bathers enjoyed. He scraped himself quickly, rinsed in whatever pool was nearest, and left. For him, the baths were functional, the only way to remove the day's grime when your apartment had no running water, which was the case for the vast majority of Romans living in the towering tenement blocks called insulae. These buildings, some rising 6 or 7 stories, had no private bathing facilities, no indoor plumbing above the ground floor, and in many cases, no reliable source of water at all above the first level. If you lived on the 5th floor of an insula, the public bathhouse was not a luxury. It was your only option. And so the baths served both extremes of Roman society, the bored aristocrat killing his afternoon and the exhausted laborer with nowhere else to wash, in the same rooms, at the same time, in the same water. The food at a Roman bathhouse was everywhere, and it was impossible to ignore. Vendors set up stalls in the courtyards, in the colonnaded walkways, even inside the bathing halls themselves, shouting their wares over the din of splashing water and echoing conversation. You could buy sausages, lucanike, grilled over charcoal braziers right outside the tepidarium door. You could buy chickpeas roasted with salt, olives drizzled in garum, the ubiquitous fermented fish sauce that Romans put on virtually everything, pastries stuffed with dates and honey, hard-boiled eggs, slices of cheese, and cups of cheap wine mixed with water and spices. The poet Martial mentions a man who would eat his way through the entire bathhouse circuit, alternating bites of food with dips in the pool, emerging hours later having consumed the equivalent of a full meal without ever sitting down at a table. The smell of cooking food mingled with the steam and the oil and the sweat to create an atmosphere that was rich, heavy, and utterly unlike anything in a modern spa. If you wanted something more substantial, taverns and cookshops clustered around the exterior of every major bathhouse, ready to serve hot meals to bathers as they emerged. But the food, abundant as it was secondary to what really sustained daily life at the baths: the physical maintenance of the body itself. Hygiene in Rome was a complex affair. You did not simply wash and leave. After your bathing circuit and your strigil scraping, you might visit a professional barber who operated out of a small stall near the palestra. Barbers did not just cut hair. They shaved faces with iron razors that had no safety guard. Nicks and cuts were so common that barbers kept supplies of spiderweb poultices and vinegar-soaked compresses to stop the bleeding. They also performed depilation, the removal of body hair, which was a serious social concern. Body hair, particularly on the underarms, legs and chest, was considered uncivilized by many Romans. The methods of removal were painful. Hot resin applied to the skin and ripped off, a direct ancestor of modern waxing. Individual hairs plucked out with bronze tweezers, or chemical depilatories made from mixtures that included bat's blood, powdered viper, and resin. The screams of men having their armpit hair plucked were so distinctive that Seneca listed them among the unbearable sounds that penetrated his apartment floor. After depilation, if you chose it, you might have a massage. Professional masseurs, called aliptae, worked in dedicated rooms near the baths, kneading muscles with olive oil infused with herbs and perfumes. A good massage after the bathing circuit was considered not merely pleasant, but medically necessary. Roman physicians, including Galen, prescribed specific bathing and massage routines for various ailments. The clothing you wore to and from the baths tells its own story. You arrived in your toga if you were a citizen, or a simple tunic if you were of lower status. The toga was a vast, unwieldy garment, essentially a semicircular woolen blanket roughly 18 feet across, and folding it properly for storage in the tiny apoditerium niche was a skill in itself. When you dressed again after bathing, your skin was oiled and scraped clean, your pores open, your muscles loose. The sensation of putting rough wool back onto freshly cleaned skin was something Romans simply lived with. Undergarments, as we know them, barely existed. There was a sublegaculum, a simple loincloth, and for women a strophium, a band of cloth wound around the chest. But you left the bathhouse feeling, by Roman standards, immaculately clean, though by modern standards, you would have been covered in a thin film of olive oil and would have smelled strongly of whatever perfume you could afford, or, if you could not afford perfume, of olive oil and sweat. What you drank at the baths was almost as important as what you ate. Wine was the universal Roman beverage, but at the baths it was typically served diluted with water, sometimes warm water, in varying ratios. Drinking undiluted wine was considered barbarian behavior, a sign that you lacked self-control. The standard mixture was roughly 3 parts water to 1 part wine, though stronger ratios were common as the afternoon wore on. Vendors circulated through the halls carrying clay pitchers, pouring cups for a few copper coins. The wine itself was often flavored, infused with honey, mixed with spices like pepper and cinnamon, or blended with seawater in a preparation called thalassemeli that modern palates would find almost undrinkable. For those who could not afford wine, there was posca, a sour drink made from vinegar diluted with water and sweetened with herbs. It was the drink of soldiers and the poor, refreshing in its tartness, if not in its reputation. Cold water was available from the fountains, but Romans generally preferred their drinks at room temperature or warm, believing that cold beverages were harmful to the digestion. The combination of heat, exercise, wine, and heavy food consumed in the steam-filled atmosphere of the baths meant that Romans often left feeling not just clean, but pleasantly intoxicated, a state the moralist Seneca found deplorable and the satirist Petronius found hilarious. The bathhouse was the social center of Roman life in a way that has no precise modern equivalent. Imagine combining the functions of a coffee shop, a gym, a library, a business lounge, a public park, and a community center into a single building, and you begin to approach what the thermae meant to Roman society. It was where deals were made. A freedman looking to establish a business connection would time his visit to coincide with the known habits of a potential patron. A lawyer preparing a case might discuss strategy with colleagues while floating in the tepidarium pool. An ambitious young man seeking political advancement would make sure to be seen at the right bathhouse at the right hour, exercising vigorously to demonstrate his fitness, engaging in clever conversation to advertise his education. The poet Martial captures a man named Monogenes who haunted the baths specifically to angle for dinner invitations, praising every serve in a ball game, picking up dropped strigils, complimenting physiques, laughing at terrible jokes, all in the desperate hope that someone would say, "Join me for dinner tonight." The baths were where you heard the news. In a world without newspapers, radio, or any form of mass media, information traveled by word of mouth, and the bathhouse was the largest mouth in any Roman city. Who had died? Who had been promoted? Which gladiator had won at the arena? What the emperor had decreed? Which ship had arrived in Ostia with a cargo of exotic spices? All of this circulated through the steam rooms and the exercise yards with remarkable speed. If something important happened in Rome, you learned about it at the baths. But the social dynamics were not egalitarian, despite the apparent democracy of shared nudity. A senator bathing alongside a freedman might be physically close, but socially distant. Wealth signaled itself even in a space where everyone was naked, through the quality of your olive oil, the number of slaves attending you, the expensive perfume you applied after your bath, the deference shown to you by staff and other bathers. A wealthy patron might arrive with an entourage of 8 or 10 slaves, one to carry his towels, one to guard his clothes, one to apply his oil, one to scrape him with the strigil, one to massage him, one to carry his food, and others simply to demonstrate by their presence that their master was a person of consequence. A poor laborer arrived alone, applied his own oil, scraped himself awkwardly, and ate whatever he could afford from the vendors. They shared the same water. They did not share the same world. The freedman Trimalchio, the fabulously wealthy protagonist of Petronius's Satyricon, a novel written in the 1st century AD, arrives at the baths with an entourage so enormous that it constitutes a small parade. His slaves carry his towels in purple-dyed linen. His personal masseur uses imported Egyptian perfume. He plays ball in the palaestra not because he enjoys exercise, but because he wants to be seen. And when he is done, he does not dry himself with the same towel he used to wipe his sweat. He has a fresh one brought, because he can. Petronius wrote Trimalchio as a satire of new money excess, but the satire works precisely because such displays were real. The baths were a theatre of status, and every Roman in the building was both audience and performer. Even the slaves attending their masters participated in this theatre, because the quality, dress, and demeanour of your slaves reflected directly on your reputation. A poorly trained slave attending you at the baths was a social embarrassment that could follow you for months. Women occupied a complicated place in bathhouse culture. The standard practice, at least during the Republic and early Empire, was to separate bathing hours. Women bathed in the morning, men in the afternoon and evening. But enforcement varied. Under some emperors, mixed bathing was tolerated or even fashionable. The Emperor Hadrian officially banned mixed bathing, suggesting that it had become common enough to warrant imperial intervention. When mixed bathing did occur, it was a source of both titillation and genuine social anxiety. Moralists thundered against it. The satirist Juvenal mocked women who exercised in the palestra alongside men, grunting and sweating in ways he considered unfeminine. But the women themselves, at least those with the social freedom to attend, appear to have participated fully and without much apparent shame. The libraries attached to the great thermae deserve special mention because they reveal something unexpected about Roman bathing culture. It was not purely physical. The Baths of Caracalla contained 2 large libraries, one for Greek texts and one for Latin, each housed in a grand hall with niched walls where scroll cases were stored. You could finish your bathing circuit, wrap yourself in a clean linen towel, and spend an hour reading Virgil or Euripides in a sunlit reading room while your skin cooled and your muscles settled. The Baths of Trajan had similar facilities and lecture halls where philosophers, poets, and rhetoricians gave public talks. The younger Pliny mentions attending a recitation at the baths, a poet reading his new work aloud to an audience of bathers still damp from the pools. The combination seems incongruous to modern sensibilities, intellectual culture alongside naked exercise and oiled bodies. But to the Romans, it was perfectly logical. The thermae was the place for the whole person, body and mind alike. You trained your muscles in the palestra, purified your skin in the pools, fed your stomach from the vendors, and sharpened your intellect in the library. To do all of this in a single afternoon, in a single building, surrounded by the full spectrum of Roman society, was not unusual. It was simply what it meant to be Roman. Entertainment extended beyond the intellectual. Jugglers, acrobats, and musicians performed in the open courtyards. Dice games and board games were played in shaded porticos. Gambling was technically illegal, but universally practiced, and the baths were a favorite venue. Fortune tellers set up near the entrance. Astrologers offered to read your fate. Professional storytellers held small crowds spellbound with tales of gods and heroes. For children, and children were present in significant numbers, the gardens and courtyards offered space to run and play, while the shallow edges of the natatio, the outdoor swimming pool, provided a place to splash and cool off. The thermae, in short, was not merely a bathhouse. It was the Roman answer to the question every civilization must answer. What do people do when they are not working? For all its splendor and social vitality, the Roman bathhouse harbored darkness that its architects never intended and its bathers could not escape. Disease was the invisible companion of every visit. The great pools were shared by thousands, and the water was not treated with chlorine or any effective disinfectant. Romans understood that stagnant water could cause illness. Their engineering of aqueducts and sewers demonstrated sophisticated hydraulic knowledge, but they had no germ theory, no understanding of bacterial transmission. The warm, moist environment of the caldarium and tepidarium was, from a modern epidemiological perspective, an ideal breeding ground for bacterial and parasitic infections. Skin diseases were rampant. The Roman physician Celsus documented a condition he called mentagra, likely a form of fungal infection that spread through Rome specifically via the baths and barber shops, transmitted by shared razors and contaminated water. Eye infections were common, carried in the same water that bathers splashed on their faces. Intestinal parasites which archaeological evidence shows were endemic in Roman populations, despite their sophisticated sanitation, almost certainly found the bathhouse an efficient transmission route. The Roman medical writer Aulus Cornelius Celsus advised people with open wounds to avoid the baths entirely, but compliance was spotty at best. Beyond disease, there was the everyday danger of crime. Theft was so commonplace that it almost ceased to be remarkable. The Digest of Justinian, the great compendium of Roman law, devotes extensive discussion to bathhouse theft, not because it was rare, but because it was so ordinary that clear legal rules were needed to manage the disputes it generated. Clothes, jewelry, money pouches, even sandals disappeared from the professional thieves, fures balneari, specialized in bathhouse work, operating in teams where one distracted the capsarius while another snatched the goods. The penalties for bathhouse theft, if you were caught, were severe: flogging, forced labor, or for repeat offenders, condemnation to the mines, which was effectively a death sentence. But the risk of getting caught was low enough that the crime persisted for centuries. Then there was the labor that made it all possible. The furnicatores who fed the hippocaust fires worked in conditions of extraordinary brutality. They operated in underground chambers that were dark, suffocatingly hot, and filled with smoke and ash. Their shifts lasted hours. They were almost exclusively enslaved people, and their work was considered among the most degrading forms of labor in the Roman world, a punishment assignment given to slaves who had displeased their masters or who had been purchased cheaply because of age, injury, or foreign origin. Above them, in the gleaming marble halls, free citizens enjoyed the fruits of that labor without a moment's thought. The bathhouse was, in this sense, a perfect microcosm of the Roman economy, spectacular comfort for the many, built on the invisible suffering of the few. There was violence too. Arguments that began in the palestra over a disputed point in a ball game could escalate quickly in an environment where everyone was naked, oiled, and had been drinking. Assaults were common enough that bathhouse managers employed security, often retired gladiators or large slaves, to keep order in the halls. And for those who came not to bathe, but to conduct business of a darker sort, the bathhouse offered shadows and crowds in which to operate. Prostitution was openly practiced in many establishments, with small rooms or alcoves. The graffiti preserved at the Baths of Pompeii, frozen in ash since 79 AD, includes explicit sexual solicitations scratched into the walls, complete with names, prices, and crude reviews of services rendered. There was also the simple, grinding reality of the smaller baths, the neighborhood balneae that most Romans actually used on a daily basis. The great imperial thermae receive all the attention because they were spectacular, but the average Roman was far more likely to visit a local bathhouse, the size of a modest restaurant, than the sprawling campus of the Baths of Caracalla. These smaller baths were often privately owned, frequently run down, and sometimes genuinely dangerous. The hippocaust systems were less sophisticated, prone to overheating in some areas and leaving others barely warm. Their water was changed less frequently. Their lighting was worse. Many balneae had few or no windows, and the interior was illuminated by smoky oil lamps that cast a dim, flickering glow over the wet tile floors. Slipping was a constant hazard. Drowning, though rarely discussed, was not impossible in the deeper plunge pools, particularly when bathers were drunk, which they often were by late afternoon. Fires were another risk. A bathhouse was essentially a building filled with steam sitting on top of underground furnaces, burning wood at high intensity. If the hippocaust overheated, if a floor cracked, if a timber support gave way, the entire structure could become a death trap. The Roman author Diocletian records instances of bathhouse fires, and the building codes established under Augustus and subsequent emperors included provisions specifically aimed at preventing such disasters. The walls between the furnace level and the bathing level had to meet certain thickness requirements. Fire brigades, the vigiles, patrolled bath districts as a priority. But in a city where over 800 baths operated simultaneously, not every establishment met the standard. The cheapest, dirtiest, most crowded balneae, clustered in the poorest neighborhoods, were often the most dangerous and the most heavily used, because the people who relied on them had nowhere else to go. And yet, despite all of this, the disease, the crime, the exploitation, the danger, Romans kept coming back. Every single day, they came back, because the alternative was worse. The alternative was isolation in a cramped, dark apartment with no running water, no social contact, no news, no entertainment, and no way to get clean. The bathhouse, for all its flaws, was where you went to feel human. And that is perhaps the most important thing to understand about it. The darkness was not a failure of the system. It was the price of admission to the only form of communal life that Roman cities offered to ordinary people. The bathhouse fell silent eventually. Not all at once, but in a long, slow decline that mirrored the decline of the empire that built it. As Rome's western provinces fragmented under the pressure of migration, economic contraction, and the collapse of the tax base that funded public infrastructure, the great thermae became too expensive to maintain. The aqueducts that fed them fell into disrepair. The forests that fueled their furnaces were depleted. The slave labor that stoked their fires became harder to command. By the 5th and 6th centuries, the great Baths of Caracalla and Diocletian stood largely empty, their marbles stripped for use in churches and palaces, their halls colonized by squatters and converted into makeshift workshops. The bathing culture that had defined Roman civic life for half a millennium simply ceased to exist in the West. It survived, in transformed form, in the Byzantine East. The great hammams of Constantinople carried the tradition forward, and later it was adopted and reimagined by Islamic civilization, where the hammam became a central institution of urban life. But in Western Europe, the culture of public bathing vanished so thoroughly that it would not return for more than 1,000 years. Medieval Europeans would come to regard frequent bathing with suspicion, even hostility. Some early Christian writers associated it with pagan decadence and bodily vanity. The very buildings that had once pulsed with the life of thousands stood as hollow shells, their vaulted ceilings open to the sky where the roof had collapsed, their mosaic floors buried under centuries of wind-blown soil and debris. Shepherds grazed their flocks in the ruined gardens of the Baths of Diocletian. Squatters built lean-to shelters against the massive brick walls of Caracalla's thermae. The marble that had once sheathed the walls was pried off and burned in lime kilns. The great bronze fixtures were melted down for coin or weapon metal. An epitaph written on a Roman tombstone captured the philosophy that had sustained the bathing culture for 500 years. Balneae, vina, Venus corrumpunt corpora nostra, sed vitam faciunt balnea, vina, Venus. Baths, wine and love corrupt our bodies, but baths, wine and love make life worth living. When the baths disappeared, something essential about Roman urban life disappeared with them. Not just hygiene, but the idea that a city owed its people a place to gather, to be clean, to be seen, to be fully and publicly alive. When you step into a modern shower and feel hot water cascade over your skin in perfect privacy, adjusting the temperature with a twist of your wrist, reaching for soap that dissolves dirt without effort, you are enjoying a luxury that a Roman emperor could not have imagined. Not the heat, not the water, which they had in abundance, but the privacy, the ease, the solitude. A Roman bathhouse was not a place to be alone with your body. It was a place to be your body, publicly, collectively, without shame, without walls, without the fiction of personal space that modern life has taught us to treat as a basic right. It was a machine for social survival. To skip the baths was not merely to be dirty. It was to be invisible, disconnected, outside the flow of news and gossip and business and friendship that made Roman urban life function. The philosopher might come for the intellectual conversation. The merchant might come for the business contacts. The laborer might come simply because it was warm and there was nowhere else to go. But they all came. Every afternoon, the bell rang and the city poured through those doors. Senators and slaves, mothers and soldiers, poets and pickpockets, into a building that for all its marble and grandeur was really just a very large, very hot room where a million small human dramas played out in the steam. This was not a spa. This was not a luxury. This was Rome, loud, crowded, brilliant, brutal, and magnificently alive.